Good morning and welcome to all of our parishioners from Sacred Heart Parish in the greater Medford area, from Jacksonville, from Shady Cove, really all who follow us here in Southern Oregon. My name is Father Ken. I'm coming to you this week with another reflection, hopefully food for your spirit. This week I have brought up a topic that I've been reflecting on for some time now. It's I guess for lack of a better way of explaining it, it falls in the category of the philosophy of law. What is the role of law in our society? Why have I been thinking about this? Well, in my view, we have seen on the continuum of law extreme unhealthy examples in both directions. For instance, you may be aware, if you follow the news at all, in the past half a year or so, there's been a strong movement in some parts of the country, in some cities, to defund the police. This is really a North American movement. Anybody, in my opinion, with common sense could tell you that the outcome of pursuing that idea would be painful and tragic, and in fact, it has proven to be the case. Every major city that has pursued this goal of defunding the police has seen a pattern of police officers resigning in great waves because of feeling a lack of support. We've seen public prosecutors just release prisoners back out into the streets rather than prosecute them for crimes committed. There have been unexplained release of prisoners from jails because of COVID reasoning. And in addition to that, we've seen huge spikes in crime in those areas. Anybody could have seen that coming. You take away law enforcement, you are promoting lawlessness. That's an extreme picture on one end of the spectrum. Lawlessness has brought city riots, destruction of private property, injury toward individuals, and sometimes even tragic death. That is obviously not the right answer, and that's not an attractive choice. But on the other end of the spectrum, we've also seen with recent current events, for instance, in Afghanistan, the debate around Sharia law. What is driving these ISIS people and Taliban individuals? They are wanting to install a more rigorous law in their land, Sharia law, and it's brutal. So brutal that, for instance, last week I heard the punishment for catching a girl or a woman wearing fingernail polishes to chop off her fingers. For a woman to walk around without face covered might end in death or throwing of acid on them. I just heard this morning that orphanages with children in them, and there are large numbers of these because of the war dead, they have established in Sharia law areas a new policy where they feed the boys first until they are full. And then if there's food left over, they give them to the girls. But there's not enough food. And so systematically girls are being starved to death in these orphanages. And there are hundreds of these terrible examples. People just being pulled aside and brutally tortured or killed or maimed. It's so horrific that parents who are trying their best to get to the air base to be flown out of the country as refugees, when they can't get in, they're tossing their children over the fence, particularly daughters, because they don't want them to grow up in that area. When I look at that idea of law, I think of St. Thomas Aquinas, who would describe that as no law at all, but violence. So that type of law is also unattractive and wrong. So where is the balance? That's the question I've been thinking about. This week, however, a third dimension of this is brought to our attention. That is the role of law in the church, in our faith. We are given the answer, I guess. To jump to the end, I'll just tell you from the perspective of the Jewish people, they said the law is a gift to us, and it helps us with two things in particular. It helps us to know the mind of God. The Ten Commandments reveal what God's priorities are and what his values are. We have, as Christians, the additional advantage of the Holy Spirit now, who helps to write that law upon our hearts, so we don't need stone tablets anymore, the role of our conscience. But the mind of God is revealed in that law, and also the idea that when we follow that law, it trains us in virtue and ultimately leads us to freedom, because all forms of sin lead us to slavery, to enslavement, to being in chains. acquiring virtue and good habit like that helps us to more easily choose what is good and holy and pleasing to God. So we live freely and joyfully and without guilt, without anxiety, without those other kinds of difficulties that sin brings to our life. That's ultimately the role. But over time, God's law expanded. I have shared in Bible studies that Moses had to add laws to the original 10 Commandments. It's an analogy of parents grounding their teenagers. If your teenager does not live under the house rule, then sometimes you have to add additional law. The role is love. It's ultimately to save souls so that we don't fall into damnation. But God allowed for that, and yet there seem to be also directives in Scripture that tells us to be very cautious about that. For instance, our first reading today that comes from Deuteronomy, we hear Moses say, "You must neither add anything to what I command you, nor take away anything from it, but keep the commandments of the Lord." Now, Moses added to it, as I just said, but he's saying, don't add to what I've added, what I've presented as the law coming from the God. And yet, ultimately, we know this problem occurred in the form of piety or ritual. At various times, the faithful have added certain kind of ritualistic practices in their worship, which started as just helpful aids to remind our heart of important truths, but over time, if left unchecked, sort of became rules in and of themselves. And this is what is unfolding in Jesus' time. He's observing the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes and the lawyers. Essentially, they're all lawyers. They are kind of irritating people on some level too. They walk around with their rule books and they try to catch people in the act of breaking their rules. And I found it kind of interesting, by the way, that this practice is still in effect to some degree. When you go to the Holy Land, we were in Old Jerusalem on the evening of the Sabbath, and one of the people in my pilgrimage group said they witnessed a group of rabble-rousers, Orthodox Jews who were going around to known businesses owned by Jews and trying to see who was still open for business after the start of the Sabbath, and they were scolding them. And sometimes mild violence was breaking out as well. So the rule checkers are still out there somewhere. But I would just note one unique way in which Jesus approaches this issue. He doesn't condemn ritual. In fact, you can point to a number of places where he encourages us to have ritual. For instance, on the Last Supper, he said, "Do this in remembrance of me." God the Father gives the Passover meal and says, "Do this annually." And we're given a liturgical calendar through the Jewish people, various dates and months where we are supposed to remember and do certain rituals in remembrance and to go on pilgrimage at certain times. So in no place is God condemning ritual, and Jesus doesn't condemn it either. But what he points out is that these people, these particular people in the crowd who are criticizing his disciples, their hearts are far from God. That's where he criticizes them. Ritual is meant to be a reminder of the heart, and he can look into their hearts and see that for them it's an empty show, which is the title of my talk today, The Empty Show. By the way, they're engaging, in this particular case I'm referring to Mark chapter 7, they're engaging in criticism of the apostles, asking why they don't wash their hands ritually before meals. But what they're really doing subtly is attacking Jesus. The idea here is that if we can criticize your students, your pupils, then in some way we are criticizing your teaching method. If it's not orthodox, if it's not correct or holy, then the teacher's the flaw. So they're coming at him kind of sideways, indirectly, through this attack. And again, as I say, he observes that their hearts are far from them. But it's a topic, I think, that is particularly critical for us as Catholics to think about. Why? Because this passage from Mark chapter 7, in my experience at least, is most often used in the greater Christian family by our Christian brothers and sisters as a critique against the Catholic Church. Particularly, we read these lines that Jesus speaks. He says, "These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandments of God and hold to human tradition." And critics of Catholicism say that's what's happening in the Catholic Church. You have a whole bunch of human tradition, human invention, and that somehow we are off the correct path, that we have made missteps. And this may shock you to hear from a Catholic priest, but I actually think that's a fair criticism. I think we have to really take this to heart, because we are susceptible to that pitfall. It's not necessary that it should happen if our heart is connected to the rituals that we employ in our worship. But if we become careless, if we go into autopilot mode, then we have some problems. For instance, let me just use the examples Mark gives. And Mark's gospel is the best for this, because in case you're not aware, Mark is writing to a group of Gentiles. They don't know anything about the Jewish faith. They're not familiar with Palestine. The people he's writing to in his gospel live in Rome and under a particular persecution, but they are sort of coming to Christianity without the roots of Judaism to work from, at least in a lived sense. They are jumping straight to Christianity. And so sometimes when he recalls the stories of Jesus, he has to go into greater detail and explain what these Jewish things involve. It's something that you would never, for instance, come across with in Matthew, because Matthew's writing to Jews. So it's kind of self-evident. They would, we assume, be aware of all these things. So Mark goes into some detail, and he says that these, in this case, Pharisees and scribes, they're criticizing the disciples because they ate with unclean, that is, unwashed hands, first of all. Now, we're not talking about basic hygiene, how you teach your kids to wash their hands before meals. That's not what's occurring here. These are ritual washings. It says more specifically later in the passage that they wash their hands as they come from market. This is one good example, that in the time of occupied Palestine, with Romans all around and with Gentile occupiers, not every trading post, not every shop catered to the kosher needs of Jews. There were also Gentile shops, and Jews were not allowed to shop in those places. They considered products sold in those locations to be unclean. Very often these type of store owners would have places of prayer set up in the back office dedicated to their gods of merchants or their gods of farmers or whatever they sold. And so the Jewish people considered them unclean, or the fact that the sellers were unclean people. And so they couldn't participate in that. But their level of piety was so rigid that they felt even made unclean walking through those kind of places. Just as I explained some weeks back about shaking the dust from your feet, that if you've traveled in pagan or Gentile lands before you cross back into the quote-unquote Holy Land, you should shake your dust from your feet so that you not even bring some of their dirt home. On the spiritual level, the idea wasn't a bad idea. It was meant that I'm going to be vigilant and focused, and I'm not going to bring morally corrupt habits into my household, with my family. We are meant to be a holy nation, a people set apart, a royal priesthood. That was part of the way they expressed that. That's the kind of washing they're talking about. And before you quickly, as a Catholic, as I say, dismiss that and say, okay, weird ritual. What do you make of us coming into the church and dipping our hand into the holy water font? That's a kind of ritual washing of hands. And if that's all you do is make your finger wet so you can sign yourself and you don't think about what you're doing, we are guilty of the very same error. That the actions of our worship are empty show, because in that moment our heart is far from God. What is the original purpose of blessing ourselves with holy water? It's a reminder of our baptism and our vocation, that we ourselves also are called to be a people set apart, a people consecrated to God's use, that we're children of God, that we're not supposed to live like non-believers in this world, but we can be guilty. Mark gives a second example. He says, for instance, they are engaged in the purification of cups and jugs and kettles and beds. As I shared with our congregation this morning, I have no idea what that entailed, but I can tell you this with confidence. When they talk about purifying, what they're really talking about is blessing things. Do we do that as Catholics? We sure do. I could show you the thickness of our book of blessings. I have been asked to bless some pretty odd things. When I lived in Napa Valley, we were asked every year to bless the first pressing of grapes by the wine producers. In Fleet Week in Astoria, we were asked to bless boats. I have been asked over the years a number of times to bless people's cars, to bless homes, to bless people's pets, and any number of other objects, particularly holy objects, but sometimes more general use objects. What is that all about? Well, if we treat it just like a superstition, it's an empty show. And our hearts are far from God, and we're Pharisees. But what is the point of it? Well, I'll just give you an example of a blessing a car. I always jokingly tell people, this does not excuse you from buying automobile insurance. This is not a guarantee that you'll never get in a car accident. If you listen carefully to the words of the blessing, what it really is, Lord, help me to be mindful of your presence. Be my traveling companion when I go, and help me by your grace to be a blessing to the people I'm going to see or I'm traveling to serve. Help me in that way. And then to be my guest in my home when I return home safely. Yes, there's a plea to keep me safe for God's service, but really it's an invitation for Christ to be present in that. And ultimately, I could summarize all the blessing of things in that way, to say we're not engaged in superstition if we're doing this authentically and according to its original intent. We're asking Christ to be present in all aspects of our life. I want you to be present in my home, at my work. I want you to be present in my recreation, in my sleep. I want you to be at the center of all my life. And those blessings help to remind us of that. But as I say, if it's just superstition, it's an empty show. And we could go on for many, many other examples. This is something that we're susceptible to as a church that has liturgical ritual. I gave some examples from Mass. For instance, why do we process into the church with the gospel book elevated up high? We do it to honor God's presence in Scripture, that his words are recorded there. It's meant to be a reverence of gratitude and respect toward the Bible. Why, before we proclaim the gospel, do we all stand? Well, it's a direct analogy to, for instance, if you're in the courtroom and the bailiff says, all rise, Justice so-and-so is coming in. We're saying all rise in respect because we're about to hear God speak in the gospel through Jesus Christ. Why does the reader of the gospel cross the page and then cross their forehead and their lips and their heart? It's not meant to be an empty thing. It's meant to be, Lord, help me to listen carefully to these words that we're all about to hear. Help them to affect my thinking. Help them to affect the way I speak to people and my actions. Help these words transform my heart so that I can love people better. It's a physical prayer, but if our heart's engaged in it, it's powerful. Why do we strike our chest during the Confiteor? Because we want to develop a true regret for the sin of our life, to take our sin as seriously as Jesus took it, because he came to die for it. Why do we genuflect? Well, from medieval times, yes, all these things being human invention, there's a reason, because that's the way you greeted a king. And when we come in the church, we want to remind ourselves we're coming into the presence of the King of the universe, the King of kings and Lord of lords. So we genuflect. And I could give hundreds of other examples. Sometime, if our congregation would like, I can schedule a number of times where we could do a teaching Mass and walk through the symbols and the rituals. But important thing is understand what we are doing. Remain engaged in what we're doing, because otherwise we are missing the point, and our worship is empty. That is a sober lesson that I bring to you today. I just want to close by offering a couple of resources for people to check this out. If you have questions, be curious about your faith. Be observant and ask, why do we do this thing or that thing? If we're not sure, we need some resources to go to. Well, I'm a resource, or any priest is a resource, so you can always ask one of us after Mass, and we'd be happy to assist. But another resource that's very reputable online is called Catholic Answers. It's just off the top of my head. It's kind of like a Wikipedia for Catholics. You can go to their website and just type in any question. Why does a priest wear green? It'll give you an answer. Why this? Why that? Another is formed.org, which our parish provides. We have videos that do walkthroughs of the Mass, so you can understand the symbols and the rituals and what their meaning is intended to be. The most important thing, though, is pursue these questions with curiosity. We've never had more resources than we do now. Find out, so that as we worship together in community, liturgically, these don't remain empty actions for us, but that our heart is drawn close to the Lord, that these rituals actually serve as they were originally intended to do, to be heart reminders. And let's never forget that in general, God's law is meant not to cramp our style, not to crash our party, but to lead us to freedom, to virtue, so that we can choose what is good and holy and right. That is the answer to the purpose of law, at least from the perspective of our faith. I leave you to ponder civil law and all of that chaos on your own. But at least we have some source of consolation and answer for this question. Join me in reflecting on the beauty of our liturgy this week and those little rituals that are meant to knock on the door of our heart, and let's grow in our knowledge of their meaning and live it out.